What was it like before the changes? It is the early 22nd century. The man doesn't know how to answer the kid's question. She knows too much. Her textbooks recall sand covering ground like this everywhere, on every coast of every sea in the world. When he was her age, he read up on the extinction of the rhinoceros, Lower Manhattan's carbon-based traffic before the seawall ruptured, Los Angeles before the fires, Southern Europe before the nets and razor wire, the Sahel and Northern Triangle before the aborted exodus, oceans before the Great Dying, Bangladesh before the drowning. Her school books footnoted the last eagles or the first border sentry drones, sure, but the old man actually remembers events she reads like legends. Temperatures push ever closer to 4 degrees. They sit on a beach in northern Michigan. He is my grandchild or yours, keeping watch over his family as best he can. The unnaturally red sun sets over the lake. In the winter, the waves still occasionally freeze, like an eerie reminder of a world resisting control. Cold snaps and polar vortexes brutally compete against mass casualty heat waves, now a casual fact of life along with Category 6 hurricanes. But she asks whether it was really true about the sand, and he smiles skeptically. Before the pulse, yes, there were undisturbed beaches like this everywhere. After the greater ice sheets collapse in the West Antarctic at the end of the 21st century, the world scrambles. It was too much on top of Greenland's melting and ice-free summers at the North Pole. A classic theological problem. What kind of gods foresee sin and yet refuse to act? Something about free will. No, not satisfying. That first pulse raises the sea level nearly 2 meters over 3 decades. Even on the coast there was sand, she asks. Not accusative, her tone. She doesn't know who to indict. For years, the managed retreat of beach towns went in fits and starts. After the pulse, though, every port and coastal city in the world is inundated. The tide pushes sand up into abandoned streets of desolate cities, swamping estuaries and choking grass and trees in salt. New high-rises built on higher ground tower over shoreline ruins. Food is already prohibitively expensive as crop yields drop on once dependable farmland, requiring expansion to less fertile land in a world struggling and failing miserably to feed 10 billion stomachs. Rations could be printed, but the subscription fees keep the unemployed starving. Capital trudges along and charts new ways to reap profit from fires and wars, even as economies plummet into never-ending crises. Nationalists respond with growing demands for trade tariffs. Louder still are their roars for blood. Economic growth stalls out below 1%, and hopes of lessening inequality disappear. The start of the permanent depression, the normal and the frightening kind. I wish you could have seen it, he replies. The oligarchs close ranks and retreat to bunkers or walled cities. New fiefdoms, amusement parks for their rotting souls. And sometimes the guards turn on the lords. Communes spring up near fresh water, which is at least somewhat insulated from the melting. Some thrive. Most are suppressed by legal tricks of eminent domain or privatized police. The last undisturbed beaches in North America, along with the fresh water, draw waves of migrants north even as temperatures scorch the Midwest. What else is there to say? Too many are displaced for reasons environmental or economic, to say nothing of the balkanization. None but the luckiest live near family. Aside from birds, most children haven't seen a wild animal. The skies are a milky white, never blue anymore because of the stratospheric aerosols they release to dim the sun. See, the Great Lakes are clustered aftermath of glacial retreat 10,000 years back. Glaciers covered much of North America at one point. When they melted away, they left rich soil deposits. Further back, shallow waters covered the American South during the Cretaceous period. Sea creatures died and their calcium carbonate exoskeletons accumulated. As carbon dioxide dropped and the polar ice caps formed, the seas withdrew and left fertile soil. Millions of years later, that fertile soil of the Black Belt would draw slaveholders to force the planting of cotton, tobacco, sugar, you name it. Set off a chain reaction of voracious capitalism and reactionary politics that, by the time climate change was discovered, stood poised and ready to murder every ecosystem in the world rich with resources, which was all of them. Very lucrative. Could there be beaches again, like on the ocean? She asks innocently. Her grandfather weighs whether to wax poetic about the Earth's ability to heal from ruin, the carbon drawdown cycles operating on timelines of thousands or millions of years. What a convoluted, cruel hope. They stole so much. So he answers, no. Welcome back to the third and final episode of the Future of Denial podcast. I'm Tad DeLay. I'll have a bonus interview or two following this 3-episode run in a few weeks, but this time we're looking at what the humanities, and specifically the Marxist critique of political economy, contributes to the environmental crises. And one more reminder, if listeners of this podcast order the book directly from Verso on their website, at checkout you can use promo code DENIAL for 25% off. The passage I just read, imagining a scene from the early 22nd century, is from my new book, Future of Denial, The Ideologies of Climate Change. The scene is loosely based around one of 5 primary futures used by the climate community to imagine horizons. The futures that I'm talking about are called shared socioeconomic pathways, and each one sets up a pair of questions. How hard will it be to mitigate emissions, and how hard will it be to adapt to the changes? The answer to those questions are imagined as socio-political narratives, which are then fed into several sophisticated, if problematic, programs called integrated assessment models, which compute projections on everything from radiative forcing and greenhouse emissions to energy prices or how many hectares of farmland we'll need. The scenarios range from successful decarbonization to full-throttle fossil fuel development, with varying levels of social investment or abandonment and barbarism in tow. As I studied that climate modeling literature, it was impossible to miss the void of the humanities. So far as I can tell, there's no significant or meaningful interaction with political philosophy, to say nothing of critiques of political economy. Much of the economic side of the model is literally projecting population growth and multiplying that by guesstimations of worker productivity based on recent data from the World Bank. And the product of that math gives us gross domestic product calculations out to usually the year 2100. I recently joined a conference on an impressive model called GCAM and had this stark experience listening to one of the experts discussing how his model could now project natural gas prices out to 2050. But importantly, I didn't take it that anyone in the room, even the expert himself, expected that the prices spit out by the model would actually be what the prices actually are on any given year. These models are not meant to be projections, but are instead research tools. But of course, if they're not projections in some sense, of what use are they? They are certainly reported in the media as projections or likely futures. But yes, to come back to my point, there is no political philosophy in these quasi-political futures. Very little history or other humanities discourses as well, and as a humanities scholar myself, I want to see more of us working in the gaps in this literature. How would public consciousness shift if journalists clarified that, in the models, the only hope of limiting warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees Celsius is called Shared Socioeconomic Pathway 1, which more or less details an overnight shift, and I really do mean a decade or two at most, a rapid shift to a worldwide Scandinavian-style social democracy. And even then, to keep warming to 1.5, we'd still need to spend trillions and trillions of dollars on carbon capture technology. I don't think people know that. What about you? I detailed these shared socioeconomic pathways in their models in the book, so I'll keep the comment light here. But limitations to integrated assessment models are no secret among climatologists and the modeling community. Models adopt a solo-swan exogenous growth approach, and GDP is calculated using a Cobb-Douglas function. Neither Marxian nor Keynesian functions show up in this neoclassical silo. No degrowth options exist. Climatologist Kevin Anderson said that these models have been as damaging to the agenda of cutting emissions as Exxon was in misleading the public about climate science. Another leading expert, modeling planetary boundaries, called these scenarios academic gymnastics that have nothing to do with reality. Among the challenges are a supply-side bias and a paradigm where lowest price points induce energy transition. Though we have ample evidence that price seldom is a dispositive factor in policy decisions. Mitigation options are narrow too. These models often force lower forcing by toggling carbon prices, and the IPCC has recommended inconceivable prices as high as $6,000 per ton of carbon dioxide by 2030 to meet the Paris Agreement goals. And obviously that's not happening. Furthermore, these integrated assessment models are opaque and exclude policymakers or anyone without specialized expertise. They are complicated systems. And how does one quantify the loss of a species or ancestral land? Most astoundingly, the economic models explicitly disregard the cost of damage from climate change. That bears repeating. The modelers fully acknowledge that these models calculating the cost of mitigation explicitly do not count the cost of damage from storms, wildfires, human displacement, destruction of food supplies, or the loss of the coasts. That's kind of eye-popping, and at the same time, I can't really blame them. How would one be able to even do that? So how would graphing Marx's law of capitalist accumulation into these models go? One of the earliest driving questions behind my book was about fossil fuel values. What's the volume of fossil fuels? How hot does it get if we burn them? And what's their current market price? Those questions combined give us an estimation of how much money is effectively stranded if we mitigate emissions to match a certain warming limit. But I couldn't find reliable numbers, and the numbers that I did find seemed just insanely too low. So I had to go digging around the International Energy Agency's reports for estimations of prices, Exxon and other industry documents for price averages and volumes, the EPA and IPCC papers for fossil fuel to CO2 conversions and warming potentials. And what I came up with, accessible fossil fuel reserves today, probably hover in the neighborhood of $259 trillion. And total fossil fuel resources, that is, the total amount in the ground, much of which we can't get to, are theoretically worth $2.4 quadrillion. To put that in perspective, burning that $259 trillion in reserves, which we are on pace to do in the next century or so, depending on the pace of the burn, would raise temperatures 1.5 degrees Celsius on top of the 1.3 so far, bringing us close to a total of 3 degrees. On the other hand, burning that 2.4 quadrillion, again, a truly impossible, absurd scenario to be sure, would raise temperatures more than 20 degrees. Nowhere on Earth but the highest latitudes could support human life at all, and then only in support of human populations measured in maybe millions rather than billions. Now again, that's an absurd scenario, but we need to understand how the market's incentives are pointed. The costs are staggering when you see that keeping temperatures low essentially requires companies and states, all of whom have these reserve revenues counted on their assets and their balance sheets, to walk away from hundreds of trillions of dollars without force. We are told this might happen because of the Paris Agreement or later national commitments. Or if we want to be a bit more serious, we must understand, you see, that renewable prices are falling and may outcompete fossil fuels, driving down demand. Never mind what happens to the price of a useful commodity when its demand is falling. Hope for the best, I guess. So capitalism isn't a roadblock for mitigation. This misrepresents the relationship to the changes. No, capitalism is not a roadblock. Capitalism is the generator. The tendency of profit to follow the path of highest return, the pressure to lure investors with ever greater profits quarter after quarter, the praise for unlimited expansion in a world of finite resources, labor exploitation and destruction of nature, the allure of cheap energy no matter the cost, and most of all the ability to discount the true ecological and social costs that don't show up yet in the price of exchange values. In such a deranged machine, climate change is a conversion disorder of capitalism. Capitalism is in turn an algorithm. We can think of it as a set of directions or rules for projecting inputs upon a range of outputs. Accumulate, accumulate, accumulate. That is Moses and the prophets, said Marx. The law of accumulation, according to Marx, is this type of independent social force. Not a physical law, but nevertheless a vibrantly real social phenomenon that requires neither villains nor plans to compel activity. Capitalism is a system defined by the accumulation of surplus, an accumulation accomplished by exploiting workers and nature. The parallel exploitations generate class inequality and metabolic rifts. The capitalist reaps where she doesn't sow twice, as it were. from labor and the land. This crude logic of capital, which Marx formulated as MCM prime, means that a drive to exploit labor and natural resources pushes us ever closer to a climate not seen since the Pliocene epoch. Accessible fossil fuel reserves are worth a couple of $100 trillion. Those total fossil fuel resources are worth $2.4 quadrillion. Incentives point in the wrong direction. So what can we do? There is that pronoun again. In a landmark study on American politics, the researchers Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page showed that while elite bourgeois and business interests determine policy, mass-based interest groups and average citizens have little or no independent influence. The impact of our opinions on policy drops to a non-significant near-zero level. Public awareness of the crisis soars to unprecedented heights. Fossil fuel reserves are still worth hundreds of trillions of dollars. This isn't about you. The capitalist algorithm takes as an article of faith what Theodor Adorno identified as the message of any horoscope column. Everything will be fine. There has never been such a monumentally difficult task, never such an existential threat, never such an interdisciplinary problem as the climate crisis. One knows the physics, another the sociology, yet another the carbon budgets. Leading experts occasionally gesture at an interdisciplinarity they not so secretly disdain. You see this in their demands to leave the science to the scientists, often in those exact words, even while proposing facile political solutions demonstrating a shallow reading of political philosophy or history. Marx warned of this problem. Quote, "The weakness of abstract materialism of natural science, a materialism which excludes the historical process, are immediately evident from the abstract and ideological conceptions expressed by its spokesmen whenever they venture beyond the bounds of their specialty." End of quote. We should read deeply where our expertise is slim. Nobody commands a God's eye view of the polycrisis. Oddly enough, one little historical irony I explore in the book is that Marx and Engels were actually reading and attending lectures by the physicist John Tyndall during the period where Marx was finishing Capital, and Tyndall was discovering how carbon dioxide created a warming effect in a planet's atmosphere. Tyndall expanded on his findings in his 1863 book Heat, Considered as a Cause of Motion. In a few brief sections on hydrocarbon experiments, Tyndall describes how certain gases permit the entrance of sunlight but block the exit of heat. Quote, "Under such a canopy, trifling as it may appear and perfectly transparent to the eye, the Earth's surface would be maintained at a stifling temperature." End of quote. He speculated that distant planets could be warmed by modifying their atmospheric envelope. So far as I can tell, Tyndall wasn't thinking about burning coal. It wasn't until a few more decades in the 1890s that another chemist calculated how burning coal would raise temperatures. But the physics were there on the page. Tyndall was one of several scientists providing inspiration on metabolism and agriculture, but not climatology for Marx and Engels. Engels read Tyndall's book in 1866 and notified Marx. Marx likely read it immediately, perhaps through a library in London, but we only have proof of him reading it in an 1870 edition of Heat, heavily marked up with Marx's handwriting. Unbearably ironic is Marx's missed opportunity during this time, had he seen the implications, to incorporate those findings into his theory of surplus value, the law of capitalist accumulation, and the movement of capital as an independent social force. Well, I guess you could say that in a small way my work is trying to suture Tyndall's discovery to Marx's critique. The deep history of Earth is a story of chemistry, of toggling the proportions of oxygen, carbon dioxide, methane, and other molecules in ways that drove life in and out of existence. It's a good story for a materialist to absorb, and I wanted to finish the podcast by adapting my chapter on the whole history of chemistry, extinctions, and civilization. Chemistry and geology are surprisingly disquieting subversive fields when you see the patterns. They don't teach you in American school, for instance, that each of the 5 mass extinctions in Earth's past tracked along with wild swings in carbon dioxide. Take the extinction at the end of the Permian 250 million years ago, which killed so much life that it is the source of much of today's fossil fuel. This was the time of Pangaea, the supercontinent surrounded by a superocean. As with all mass extinctions, the details remain somewhat hazy. Siberia erupted with flood basalts, not normal, singular volcanic eruptions, but continuous flows of lava spilling from Earth's mantle, and with them sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide. Lava probably lit up coal deposits and assaulted the atmosphere with volleys of greenhouse gas. Pangaea's arrangement, a supercontinent with less coastal space, meant less shoreline for rock weathering and more carbon dioxide concentrating unabated. Heat disrupted the ocean circulation current, so fewer storms over the supercontinent meant less rainfall and ever less rock weathering, disabling Earth's natural cycles of removing carbon dioxide. See, it's not just the amount of carbon dioxide that triggers mass extinctions, it's the pace of injection too. A 10 degree Celsius average temperature at the beginning of the Permian shot up to 32 degrees by the end. Too much, too quickly. As much as 95% of life ended in the Great Dying at the end of the Permian. Casualties turned into coal and oil. It took only 75,000 years because carbon dioxide rose faster than at any point in Earth's history, up until the 21st century, when carbon dioxide concentration is rising about 100 times faster than in the Permian. Now, the last 2.5 million years are called the Quaternary period. Technically all of it an ice age where temperatures have been lower than the average in Earth's deep past. All members of the Homo genus descend from Australopithecus, which first appeared more than 4 million years ago and gave birth to multiple hominid lines during the Quaternary first phase, the Pleistocene epoch. Archaic humans split off and met again. The old picture was that of a tree trunk branching off, but we now know the ancestry looked more like a braided river delta. The only surviving line today is our species, Homo sapiens. We're pretty sure we evolved in southern Africa. The earliest Homo sapiens remains are found at Jebel Irhoud in Morocco and date to 300,000 years ago. The species emerged out of Africa in several waves. They evolved, mated with archaic humans, and split off again, all while adapting strategies to survive climate changes. The climate changed largely in response to Milankovitch cycles in Earth's orbit and tilt, which changed the amount of sunlight received. Temperature changes, in turn, cause more carbon dioxide to be sequestered or released by the oceans and the land, driving temperature effects even more. In an unusually hot time 125,000 years ago, the Eemian interglacial period sent temperatures rising for the last time before the 20th century. The climate briefly warmed to 2 or 3 degrees above what we now call pre-industrial levels, or in the range of what we may see later this century. Oceans pulsed 5 to 10 meters higher. Aside from 2 smaller temperature spikes, 240,000 years and 216,000 years ago, until recently, the Eemian was the only time humans ever experienced temperatures above the pre-industrial norm. Agriculture was absent in the Pleistocene, but a necessity in the Holocene. At the end of the last glacial period and the beginning of this interglacial period in which we've lived for 11,700 years, we entered the Holocene epoch, or what archaeologists call the beginning of the Neolithic period. Here, we began planting the first founder crops. Starting in the Fertile Crescent, growing populations stimulated an agricultural revolution in grains, which led to higher fertility. Communities in Southeast Asia developed agriculture too, and then over the next few thousand years, agriculture spread or was independently developed. 5,000 years ago, an anomalous rise in methane corresponded to changes in land use as humans learned to flood lowlands and irrigate crops. According to one Just So story, with surpluses of food, labor divided such that some were priests and soldiers among the majorities of farmers. But this process was neither linear nor immediate. The record tells us our ancestors experimented with many agricultural and organizational styles, some more egalitarian than others. In the Levant, permanent settlements in the Natufian period existed prior to widespread crop and animal domestication. And there was a curious 4 millennia gap between the earliest grain cultivation and livestock domestication and the first truly agrarian pastoral societies. By 7,000 years ago, hundreds of communities in the Fertile Crescent were cultivating crops. The nature of the relationship between crops and hierarchies are contested, but over the first few thousand years of agricultural development, our ancestors built the earliest towns, like the settlement at Catalhuyuk some 9 millennia ago, with a population eventually as high as 10,000. The early agrarian states along the Tigris and Euphrates, such as Uruk, built on the backs of slave labor we typically think of as the effect of crop domestication, did not dominate southern Mesopotamia until 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. In the unusually stable interglacial period, carbon dioxide never budged above 280 parts per million. Unlike the end of the Pleistocene, when sea levels rose a meter every couple decades for several centuries, Holocene shorelines eventually stabilized. Trade required a memory technology. 50-plus centuries ago, the Sumerians developed cuneiform. The cumbersome language required scribes to commit hundreds of signs to memory. They recorded their trades conducted along the Euphrates and over land. One of the earliest common symbols meant female slave of foreign origin, a testament to Uruk's class society emerging alongside writing and surplus labor. Then, 30 centuries ago, seafaring Phoenicians used their alphabet to record trades throughout the Mediterranean settlements made possible by stable carbon dioxide that had fixed the sea level a millennium prior. A side effect of this technology, humans eventually record their oral traditions as written text, the Vedas, Enuma Elish, and the Epic of Gilgamesh. Aside from certain indigenous traditions, all extant contemporary religions, philosophies, and values were born after, and thus can little conceive a world without, the class hierarchies enabled by agricultural surplus made possible by one configuration in Earth's Milankovitch cycles. We traded and consumed energy from plants and animals, exposed to small fluctuations in the climate we couldn't possibly understand. Once Europe began its exploration and genocides in the New World, while dealing with the Reformation and wars at home, the Little Ice Age dropped global temperatures a fraction of a degree for several centuries. The dates of the Little Ice Age are contested, but what seems clear is that a quarter-degree temperature drop in the 13th century, likely from reduced solar activity and perhaps increased volcanic activity, was followed by a plummet of an additional half-degree when Europeans arrived in the Americas, a popular theory being that the indigenous genocide resulted in forest growth sinking carbon dioxide. This was a drop from which the world did not recover until the 19th century. During the cold, famines and bread riots and angry peasants meant political instability and scapegoating. Europeans shrank from malnutrition and blamed Jews for plague and accused women of witchcraft. Hostilities boiled into a 30 Years' War, a dynastic struggle in the guise of a religious war crossed with emerging economic competition, all of which, along with hunger, battle, social unrest, all of it contributed to the general crisis of the 17th century. That war concluded with the Peace of Westphalia, weakening the Holy Roman Empire as state sovereignty took shape, though not before the Puritans and other sects sought refuge by joining in the colonization of the Americas. Protestantism turned faith into a matter of individual conviction, starting a countdown to the death of God at the precise moment that a new post-feudal mode of production distributed coats and food produced by wage labor with varying success on a market. Enslavement, land enclosure, and novel financial techniques and entities like the joint stock company supercharged a heretofore unimaginable level of surplus exploitation as the emerging capitalist mode of production created new social architectures practically begging for an explosion of cheap energy. Colonizers in the Americas faced harsh winters, but their markets and beliefs consumed every square meter of the world. Throughout the entire existence of Homo sapiens, the climate was only ever warmer than now, in the Eemian interglacial period some 125,000 years ago, and then only barely. But in the late 18th century, James Watt invented a steam engine powered by coal. All heretofore existing civilization had drawn power from animals or biomass such as wood. Not so anymore. Capitalist expansion, settler colonial racism, technological development, and electrification drew on fossil fuels as a one-time injection of cheap energy. In the early days of the population boom, prophets of doom like Thomas Malthus predicted mass starvation, but at the start of the 20th century, the chemist Fritz Haber discovered how to fix nitrogen to fertilize land, which, in conjunction with the agricultural green revolution later in the century, made it possible to feed billions extra and, in the process, change Earth chemistry in yet stranger ways. Sometimes we engineer our way out of a problem. Sometimes we don't. Around the same time the Haber process came online, another chemist, Svante Arrhenius, figured out that rising carbon dioxide injected by coal would raise temperatures. It was nearly a century before the public learned there was a problem. Thanks for listening. If you've enjoyed following along, if you want to think further about denial, or just want a well-rounded book on all parts of the climate crisis, from carbon budgets and climatology to energy systems to migration to the whole deep history of Earth, check out my new book, Future of Denial: The Ideologies of Climate Change, out now from Verso. Much of the script of this podcast is adapted from the book, giving you a sense of the style. And please spread the word. And if I can be overly sincere for a moment, the great changes of the 21st century are going to be the most rapid, possibly innovative, and certainly apocalyptic time that human beings have ever experienced. You live at the front edge of the largest migration or displacement of human beings that has ever happened or ever will happen. We aren't entirely sure there's a way out for something currently configured as civilization. We are not subjects who desire to know, but instead we are subjects who desire. And we are running out of time.